You hear the chains before you see them. They drag across the stone floor, scraping in a rhythm that sounds too slow to be human. The air is thick with the scent of iron and damp earth, the kind that seeps into your lungs and settles there. A single torch flickers against the wall, its light trembling as if it too fears what it sees. The corridor narrows ahead of you. Footsteps echo from somewhere unseen, heavy and deliberate. You can tell that the person being dragged is no longer resisting. The sound of her struggle has faded into small, broken breaths. When she stumbles, the chain tightens, and a dull cry escapes her, a sound that doesn't echo. It falls flat against the cold, wet walls. The men pulling her say nothing. Their faces are hidden beneath shadowed hoods, their movements practiced, mechanical. You realize they've done this before, many times. The silence around them is not reverent. It's routine. You follow as they reach the end of the corridor. A heavy wooden door bound with iron bands. One of them pushes it open, and the hinges groan as though the room itself protests what's about to happen. The air that spills out is colder still. You step through, and the sound of the outside world dies instantly. The chamber is large, circular, and darker than it should be. Stone walls glisten with moisture. Chains hang from hooks. A single table sits to one side, scattered with tools you can't quite name. And at the center of the room, under the flickering torchlight, stands something that at first looks like furniture, but isn't. It rises taller than a man, shaped in cruel geometry, wood-polished, smooth, iron edges catching the light. It's too clean to be old, too purposeful to be random. Its surface gleams as if recently oiled. You can't look away from the point at its center. Narrow, gleaming, deliberate, it is neither blade nor weapon, but something worse, an invention meant to sustain pain, not deliver death. The guards stop just before it. The woman's knees buckle, her body folding beneath the weight of the chains. She whispers a name, maybe a prayer, maybe a memory. Her hair clings to her face. You can see her eyes now, wide, glassy, disbelieving. She knows what this is. She's seen it before, perhaps in dreams whispered through the cells, stories traded between the condemned. A man steps forward from the shadows. He wears the robes of authority, the insignia of judgment. His voice is calm, almost soft. He tells her this is for her soul, that pain cleanses sin, that confession will bring mercy. His words are smooth, memorized and utterly hollow. The guards lift her arms. The sound of rope tightening fills the air. You take a step closer. You can hear her breathing, shallow, trembling, but still steady. Her strength surprises you. For a moment you think she might resist, but then she looks at the device again, and something inside her seems to vanish. Her body sags, as though surrender itself is a relief. The torchlight dances across the room, and for a heartbeat you think the thing at the center is moving, but it's just the light. The polished wood seems to pulse, the metal edges shimmer. You imagine how many times it has been cleaned, how many have stood where she stands now. The weight of history presses down. You want to look away, but you can't. No one ever can. The man in robes raises his hand. The guards pull. The woman's cry breaks the silence, sharp, human, final. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything stops. In that frozen moment, you understand what you are seeing. It isn't execution, it's endurance. This device was never made to kill. It was designed to make a person wish for death. What kind of mind creates a machine meant not to end life, but to destroy the will to live? If this already made you uncomfortable, good. It means you still have empathy. Most people scroll past suffering. Don't. Subscribe, because history shouldn't repeat while we look away. It happened in an age when obedience was the highest virtue, and fear was the language of faith. You lived in a world where questioning authority was not defiance, it was heresy. The year is buried somewhere between plagues and prayers, when kings ruled by divine right and the church shadowed every courtroom, every confession, every breath. In that world, pain was not cruelty. It was justice refined to perfection. In the cities, iron bells tolled not for mercy but for order. Sermons preached of salvation through suffering. The streets were filled with men who spoke of purity while building prisons beneath cathedrals. You could be accused by a neighbor, condemned by a whisper, erased by the suspicion of thought. To confess was to survive a little longer. To deny was to vanish. The Inquisition called it purification. The monarchy called it loyalty. Each authority, draped in its own holiness, agreed on one thing: fear must always outweigh doubt. So they turned justice into a ritual. Judges became priests of punishment. Their chambers were sanctuaries of pain, and their instruments, sermons in steel and wood. This was not madness, it was method. The system worked because people believed it must. They feared chaos more than cruelty. Every confession carved order into the world again, one scream at a time. Every execution reminded the faithful that power belonged to those who could decide who lived and who begged first. The machine you saw was born out of that obedience. It was crafted for silence, not the silence of death, but the silence of submission. It made truth irrelevant, because under enough agony, every lie sounded holy. The torturer did not have to shout. The device did the preaching for him. Imagine living under that weight, knowing that one accusation, one wrong word, could bring you to the same chamber. You would pray louder, obey harder, watch your own thoughts for treason. You would learn to smile when spoken to by power, and you would teach your children that quiet was survival. The church kept the records locked in parchment and wax, but the truth seeped through. They said the machines were built to save souls, to make confession swift. But salvation had a shape. It stood tall, carved of wood and iron, waiting patiently for those who faltered in faith. It was the age when obedience meant erasure. They didn't need to kill everyone who disagreed, only enough to remind the rest what obedience cost. If hearing this unsettles you, it should. The story you're listening to was not a secret. It was a system, accepted and applauded. Most people back then stayed silent, because they feared being next. Today, silence looks different. You can scroll past, pretend it doesn't matter, move on. But if you've listened this far, then part of you knows history is whispering again. Don't look away. Subscribe, because these truths were hidden once, and that's how they survived. The device did not appear out of nowhere. It was conceived, commissioned, and perfected by hands that believed they were serving righteousness. Its birth began not in dungeons, but in workshops, where iron met purpose, and the craftsman's skill became theology in motion. The order that demanded it was no mere circle of sadists. It was a sanctioned tribunal, a council of scholars, priests, and magistrates, who saw pain as proof, and confession as purification. They met in vaulted halls lined with parchment and law. They argued about the limits of endurance, about how much agony the body could withstand before the soul surrendered its secrets. Somewhere in those discussions, philosophy turned into design. They drew sketches in ink and soot, diagrams of angles and pivots, of pressure points and pulleys, instruments that would extract truth through suffering. Their language was cold, mathematical. They called it refinement, not cruelty. A blacksmith named Alonso de Verona, a man whose skill with metal was whispered about from court to cloister, was chosen to bring their theory to life. He was promised salvation for his service, wealth for his silence. In his forge, he heated iron until it glowed white, shaping it into joints that would move with the precision of an executioner's breath. Each curve, each spike, each beam of wood was measured not by beauty, but by endurance. The first prototype was crude, too heavy, too quick to kill. They wanted something slower, something that could hold a body in pain without breaking it too soon. Alonso adjusted the balance, reshaped the frame, added the mechanism that would let the torturer control the descent inch by inch. The second version worked. It didn't tear, it persuaded. The tribunal watched its first use through a narrow slit in the chamber wall. When the victim confessed before death, they declared it a success. They gave it a name that no longer survives an official record, erased perhaps deliberately, but its shape endured in sketches, smuggled out by scribes, and in whispered testimony written down decades later. The chroniclers who dared to document it used neutral terms: instrument of inquiry, mechanism of conversion. Yet between the lines, their descriptions reveal fascination and fear. One wrote that the design was a marriage of geometry and guilt. Another noted that its form reflects the belief that the body is the door through which truth must be forced. The logic behind it was simple and horrifyingly effective. Pain was the language of honesty. Under agony, the innocent and the guilty sounded the same, and so the device became the perfect judge. It turned suffering into evidence, and the absence of blood into divine approval. To the men who ordered it built, its silence after confession was proof of their moral victory. Every hinge of that machine was an argument for control. Every bolt and beam echoed with the reasoning that still hides beneath systems of power today, that fear brings order and obedience cleanses sin. And behind it all stood the craftsman, a man who claimed he only followed orders, that his forge was neutral. History never records what became of him. The tribunal thrived, the design spread. In archives hidden beneath convents, fragments of his work remain, rough sketches marked with notes in faded ink. Reduce pressure by one turn, use oak for strength, maintain structure through weight, not speed. It reads like a manual for endurance, not punishment. You can almost hear the hammer's echo, the steady rhythm of a man shaping history's most terrifying silence. You're hearing facts that most textbooks censor. If you can handle this level of truth, prove it. Subscribe or tell me in the comments why you'd rather stay comfortable in ignorance. The device stands before you, still and patient, the echo of its creation trapped within its frame. At first glance, it looks deceptively simple. A wooden structure, triangular in design, reinforced with iron brackets that gleam beneath the torchlight. But when you move closer, the precision becomes apparent. Every edge, every notch, every joint serves a purpose. It was not made to mutilate quickly. It was built to control, to calculate, to prolong. The base is wide and solid, carved from oak, dense, unyielding. The wood has been treated with oil, not for preservation, but for efficiency, to reduce friction where the ropes slide. Rising from that base is a tall column of timber, narrowing toward the top until it forms a sharp, polished apex. The angle is deliberate, steep enough to pierce skin slowly, shallow enough to deny release. From above, thick ropes descend from a beam attached to the ceiling. Each rope passes through an iron ring, the tension adjustable by hand-cranked pulleys. The victim was suspended by those ropes. Wrists bound, ankles drawn tight, body lifted just high enough to dangle over the point. One twist of the crank and gravity did the rest. The entire mechanism relied on weight, the physics of pain made predictable. The torturer didn't need brute strength, he needed patience. Each turn of the pulley adjusted the descent by fractions of an inch, turning the body's own mass into an executioner's tool. The slower the drop, the longer the mind had to understand what was happening. Contemporary records describe how the design distributed pressure. It spared major arteries at first, keeping the victim conscious, ensuring that suffering could be observed, recorded, interpreted as progress. This wasn't chaos, it was ritual. Observers took notes. They timed confession against collapse, faith against flesh. Every variable, angle, rope tension, duration was measured, refined. Surviving sketches from tribunal archives show the engineering in unnerving detail. They are annotated like architectural plans, labeled in Latin, caput vinculum, head restraint, funus superior, upper rope, centrum doloris, the point of pain. The handwriting is steady, as though drafted by an academic, not a torturer. One marginal note reads, maintain composure, confession requires lucidity. Another simply states, God sees all. What made this device different from the countless others of its age was not its brutality, but its intent. It offered no spectacle for crowds, no swift retribution, no bloodied theater of execution. It was used behind closed doors, where silence and prayer blurred into science. The torment was invisible to the public, and that invisibility was part of its power. It terrorized by rumor alone. No one needed to see it. They only needed to know it existed. The true genius of its design was psychological. The victim rarely died quickly. Many were returned to their cells half-broken, minds fractured, confessions scrawled in trembling hands. The memory of what awaited them was enough to keep entire communities obedient. It transformed fear into governance. The sound of the pulley turning became an unspoken law. Modern historians who have examined fragments of surviving mechanisms describe the craftsmanship as meticulous, almost reverent. Some compare it to the work of clockmakers. So precise were the alignments of wood and metal. One researcher wrote that it was designed not merely to cause pain, but to map it. In museums today, reconstructions stand behind glass, labeled as instruments of faith and discipline. Visitors often stare in silence, unsure whether they're looking at an artifact of cruelty or an expression of genius. The polished wood gleams beneath sterile light, and for a moment you can almost forget what it was made for. That's how evil endures, not by hiding, but by being understood as craftsmanship. The design wasn't just cruel, it was mathematical. Its symmetry mirrored the logic of the world that birthed it, structured, justified, divine in its order. And the most chilling truth is this: it was not built for one person. It was replicated, standardized, improved. Blacksmiths across provinces received blueprints. Carpenters copied the measurements. It became an export of obedience, a mass-produced sermon in wood and iron. If you've watched this far, it's because part of you needs to understand. Don't just watch. Subscribe, because you're one of the few who doesn't turn away when history gets real. Her name was Isabel de Marcen. She was 31, the daughter of a tailor, born into a world where her worth was measured in obedience. She could read, which was unusual for a woman of her station, and that simple gift would one day be used against her. She was accused of heresy for possessing a page of scripture written in her own hand, a verse she'd copied not out of rebellion, but reverence. That page, folded and hidden inside a book of prayers, became the evidence that damned her. The accusation began with a whisper. A neighbor told a priest that Isabel had questioned a sermon. It was enough. The report traveled up the chain, from priest to magistrate, from magistrate to the tribunal. Within a week, she was taken from her home before dawn. Her door was left open, her belongings catalogued as if she'd already ceased to exist. The neighbors watched in silence, heads bowed, the way people do when they're grateful it isn't them. The interrogation began with words, always words. They asked her to admit what she had done, to name those who influenced her. When she hesitated, they called it pride. When she wept, they called it deceit. Each denial confirmed her guilt. The room was small, the air stagnant, heavy with incense meant to sanctify the cruelty within. A scribe sat at a table in the corner, recording every question, every tremor in her voice, translating fear into evidence. For 3 days they questioned her, alternating promises of mercy with threats of damnation. They told her that pain could cleanse, that the body was a vessel for redemption. On the 4th day, she stopped answering. That was when they decided she would be brought before the device. The walk to the chamber was short, but it stretched endlessly in her mind. She could hear her footsteps echo along the corridor, a hollow rhythm between two worlds, the living and the condemned. The guards said nothing. The priest walking beside her murmured scripture under his breath, not to comfort her, but to remind himself that this was holy work. When the door opened, the air changed. The room seemed larger than it was, its emptiness amplifying every sound. The machine stood at its center, waiting. The torchlight shimmered across its polished surface, casting reflections that danced like ghosts along the walls. She stopped walking, her body locked by instinct. One of the guards nudged her forward, and the chains around her wrists clicked softly, the sound sharp against the silence. The Inquisitor addressed her as child. He told her that confession would save her soul, that resistance was rebellion against divine authority. His voice was calm, almost kind, as he explained how salvation required cooperation. The logic was flawless in its madness. To suffer was to serve, to confess was to survive, and to die in agony was to prove devotion. Isabel listened, trembling, but said nothing. The priest asked if she understood. She nodded once, then he stepped aside, and the guards moved in behind her. The ropes were prepared. The device gleamed. The air was thick with the scent of oil and old wood. She took one last breath, slow, deliberate, defiant, as if to remind herself that she was still alive, still herself. They began to move her toward it. The torchlight shifted, shadows crossed her face, and in that moment she seemed both terrified and strangely calm. Her eyes did not plead, they accused. They asked the question her lips could no longer form. What kind of faith requires this? The guards hesitated. The Inquisitor did not. He gave the order. The ropes tightened. The last sound in that chamber was not a scream, but a gasp, brief and human, swallowed instantly by the stone walls. Then silence, deep, absolute, the kind that follows when something irreparable has been done. She doesn't have a voice. You do. If you can listen to her story and still scroll away, that silence becomes part of the same cruelty. Subscribe, not for me, but for every story they tried to erase. Pain was not chaos to them. It was a science, measured, observed, perfected through repetition. The human body, they believed, revealed truth when pushed past the threshold of endurance. Every nerve, every tendon, every drop of blood was a vessel of confession waiting to be opened. When the machine did its work, the body responded predictably. Physicians of the time, sanctioned observers cloaked in moral authority, took notes as if conducting divine experiments. They described the progression in detached precision. First came muscular tension, the involuntary convulsions of resistance. Then the pulse quickened, pounding against its own vessel as if trying to escape. Breathing grew shallow, irregular, each gasp an act of defiance against the pressure building within. As the minutes stretched, the body began to surrender. Capillaries ruptured beneath the skin, blood pooling where pressure was greatest. The heart, deprived of balance, faltered between acceleration and collapse. They called this the stage of divine persuasion, when pain no longer screamed but whispered, when the mind detached itself from flesh, and the confessor's voice grew faint, then strangely calm. One physician of the Holy Tribunal, Dr. Gregorio Salvatierra, wrote of these stages as if chronicling nature itself. His manuscripts, preserved in fragments, describe agony in terms of response curves and threshold breaks. He observed that prolonged suffering altered the very rhythm of the heart, creating a pattern he called the cadence of repentance. He noted that death rarely came quickly, that the mind often persisted beyond what the flesh could bear. Their goal was not to kill. Death was a failure of process. The perfect session balanced just below the point of fatality, where consciousness flickered but never went out. Controlled agony. That was the term they used. The body became an instrument to be tuned, adjusted, maintained. Pain was a medium, confession the result. The torturers worked with the precision of scholars. They understood blood flow, they studied breathing, they experimented with posture and weight. Their records reveal an unsettling mastery of anatomy. They learned that certain positions starved the limbs before the heart, that temperature could dull or heighten sensation, that the mind, when deprived of light and sound, became its own tormentor. They called these findings useful knowledge, lessons in human nature, later cited in treatises on obedience and spiritual purification. And so, what began as superstition became method. The line between science and cruelty blurred until there was no line at all. The laboratory and the dungeon spoke the same language, control through understanding. They learned exactly how long a person could survive pain, not to save lives, but to keep them conscious long enough to confess. It is easy to imagine these men as monsters, but they were not. They were educated, respected, and often devout. Their journals are filled with prayers written between the notes, apologies to God for the things they witnessed, and perhaps for the satisfaction they felt in witnessing them. How do we call it justice when it's science used for pain? When knowledge itself becomes an accomplice? When reason is harnessed not to heal but to harm? These are not questions for the past. They are questions for every age that worships progress without conscience. You've heard the facts they never meant for you to hear. If you can confront them without turning away, then you already understand why this story matters. Subscribe. Because truth without memory is just repetition, and repetition is how cruelty survives. When the screams finally stopped echoing through the chambers of judgment, the world above them pretended not to hear. The tribunals went on for decades. Their archives grew heavier than their consciences. And yet, slowly, cracks began to form in the order they had built on suffering. Word spread, not through rebellion, but through rumor. Merchants carried whispers of the devices hidden in cathedrals. Sailors told stories of rooms that swallowed people whole. Priests who once blessed the interrogators began to question whether salvation demanded so much cruelty.
In some cities, laws were drafted to curb excess, to remind the faithful that confession should come from the heart, not the body. But those laws were written in daylight and ignored in darkness. The devices were not destroyed, they were hidden. The orders that once oversaw them dissolved in name, but their methods survived in the hands of new authorities, kings, generals, inquisitors, reborn under different titles. The language of faith was replaced by the language of security, of progress, of necessity. The tools changed shape, the uniforms changed color, but the logic remained the same: obedience through fear, control through pain. Centuries passed, empires fell, science rose, draped in the promise of enlightenment. But the same knowledge once used to map agony found new uses: experiments on prisoners, on the poor, on the voiceless. The machine was gone, but its design lived on in principle: the belief that pain reveals truth, that breaking the body exposes the soul. History did not end it, it only refined it. The church eventually condemned the old methods. The tribunals were disbanded. Statues were raised to mercy, to justice, to human dignity. But beneath every monument, beneath every declaration of progress, lies the same silence that followed Isabel de Marcen's final breath. The world moved on, not because it learned, but because it forgot. And still, in moments of crisis, you can hear the echo. In interrogation rooms, in wars fought under banners of purity, in the rhetoric of those who claim that suffering justifies order. The language changes, the tools evolve, but the instinct remains. History doesn't vanish. It waits, in silence, for repetition. That is the true legacy of the machine, not the wood or the iron, but the idea that cruelty can ever be righteous. If you can watch this, learn from it, and still not hit subscribe, maybe you've forgotten that awareness is action. Don't be passive. Join us at Hidden Truths of History, because silence is how they win. She was dragged onto it once, just once, but that single moment, that single act, carried the weight of 1,000 years of human cruelty. The walls that witnessed her suffering have long turned to dust. The iron has rusted back into the earth, and yet her silence remains. It lives beneath the surface of our progress, in the shadows of our justice, in the quiet justifications we whisper when cruelty serves order. Her story was never meant to survive. It wasn't written by victors or carved into marble. It lived in the mouths of those who remembered in secret, who whispered her name when the church bells tolled, who carried fragments of her truth through the centuries until history finally allowed them to speak. Every civilization buries its guilt. It builds monuments to the light and hides the blood beneath the stone. But memory is persistent. It waits, patient and unyielding, pressing against the edges of forgetfulness until someone, somewhere, decides to listen again. If you close your eyes, you can still hear it. Not her scream, but the silence that followed. That silence is what endures. It is the sound of humanity refusing to look at itself, the sound of lessons unlearned, the sound of history pretending to move forward while walking in circles. She was dragged onto it once, but her story still stands, not as a relic of the past, but as a mirror held up to the present. Every time you remember her, every time you question what power calls justice, she lives again, not in pain, but in defiance, because remembrance is rebellion. This is Hidden Truths of History, where silence ends and truth speaks.